Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stay at Home. This is a political education series by Jacobin magazine. My name is Kel Brooks. I'm the video producer for the series. Boscar's out tonight, but he'll be back on Friday. Multiple times a week, every week for the last few months, we've been sitting down with a left-wing thinker, writer, organizer, to talk about a relevant or pertinent political issue on the left. And then we followed it up with a Q&A. But tonight we're doing something a little bit different. Kind of a discussion with three great comrades on the left. Before we get to that, I wanted to just mention some upcoming events that you should know about. On Friday, we have the trade unionist Bill Fletcher Jr. talking about Juneteenth, the need for Juneteenth to be a national holiday, as well as America's Incomplete Emancipation. And then on Saturday, we'll have another episode of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. And our guest that day will be Sean Jacobs from Africa as a Country. But tonight, we're joined by Matt Christman and Amber Lee Frost from Chapo Trap House. They're also writers. They've both written for Jacobin. We are also joined by Ben Fong, who is a professor at ASU, as well as an editor at Damage Magazine. And so tonight we're talking about why you should log the fuck off. And it's loosely based on a piece that Ben wrote a couple years ago called Log Off. It probably should have been called Log the Fuck Off at the time, but we kept it safe. And so I said loosely just because we're now updating it more for the moment that we're in, that I think it made sense for Jacobin to offer some Marxian takes on the political economy of all of us being stuck on Zoom 24 hours a day now. So I'm going to hand it off to Ben in a moment, and I'll come back later for Q&A if we want to do Q&A. Kind of just up to our guests. If you guys don't want to do Q&A, we can skip that, but I'll be looking for good questions and I can jump back in later. So I want to thank the guests again for joining us. I want to thank all of you for watching. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, please share the stream. You guys are how we get these videos out to more people. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
All right. Thanks, Cale. Thanks to Jacobin for hosting the call, and thanks to Amber and Matt for being on too. Just as a bit of background, I came to this topic in doing research for a forthcoming book on drugs in the history of capitalism, and more specifically through looking at what's really a fairly new category, what's called behavioral addiction, like behavioral as opposed to physical addiction. And the two most interesting iterations of this category are sex on the one hand, so the idea that we can profitably understand certain kinds of sexual behavior as forms of addiction, and then technology on the other hand. So I took some of the research I had collected on the latter topic and published an article in Jacobin a few years back, if anyone's interested in looking that up. But I will mostly steer clear of that material right now. This is a difficult topic to approach. I've had a lot of conversations with people about it over the years, as I'm sure many of you have. And I still really don't know what the proper point of entry is. It's just sort of too close to people's lives in some ways. And I think that for many, like any criticism of social media as a form, it sort of comes across as like old and grumpy, I guess. Like back in my day, we used to have real conversations, kind of thing. And if it is accepted, it's accepted in kind of a cynical mode. So someone says, "Yeah, like I know Twitter is horrible," and then they stare at their screen for an hour scrolling through tweets. I guess what I'd say as a word of preface is that when I'm critical of social media and what follows, I'm not criticizing like something that someone else is like doing over there as if I'm like somehow free from the muck of the mire. It's more that I'm criticizing tendencies I find in myself and people that I have a great deal of respect for. And I think that we on the left in particular should try to get much better about getting less defensive, less cagey about these broad sorts of criticisms, and I guess more willing to see our own tendencies, the things that we do, as unproductive, possibly sometimes psychotic, tribal, and so forth, as a way of hopefully becoming more constructive, less tribal, etc. So since I'm kicking things off, I thought I'd go big and talk about the Socialist Project in general, and then maybe later in the conversation we can drill down into more particulars. Now, this is a text that no doubt many Jacobin readers are familiar with, so I won't dwell on it too long. But in Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, he talks about alienation in capitalist society in 4 different senses. So first, there's an alienation from the things that we produce, from the commodities we produce. Second, there's an alienation from the process by which those things are produced. Third, there's an alienation from what Marx calls our species being, or like broadly our human capacities. And finally, there's alienation from one another, from other human beings. And counterintuitively, he actually doesn't spend much time discussing this last category because he kind of thinks it's implied by the others. Anytime you get a situation where people lack control over their means of livelihood, where we feel reduced to components in a more impersonal process, and where we're not freely and creatively working on our environment, but rather unfreely dominated by it. Anytime you get those kinds of conditions, it's only natural that people are going to be mistrustful, spiteful, and even hateful of one another. And the hope in overcoming capitalism for Marx is, of course, that we get rid of class division and domination and all that stuff, but also that we remove what Marx calls the character masks that we're all forced to wear in capitalist society, and enter into a more free association where we are more capable of recognizing and even enjoying one another in our complex humanity. I mean, that's really the goal. That's the goal for Marx, that we are free in and through our mutually enriching interactions. And I think even given the multiple character masks that we wear, and the deep damage that capitalist society has done to subjectivity, we all catch glimpses of this kind of interaction. Like, we all know what it is, even if it's in just very fleeting moments of respect, of love, tenderness, empathy, creativity, insight, and so forth. We all know these moments of genuine and deep human relating, but more often than not, we also know how those moments can be spoiled, and not just by our own individual hangups, we all have those, but really by our existence as capitalist subjects, like by the fact that we're too busy, we're anxious about our bills, the rent, our status, we're overly competitive, we're putting on a good face, Now, it's obviously foolish, I think, to think that these things are like, personal developmental hurdles or something, like things that we need to work on individually, because, there's no such thing as overcoming the humiliations and anxieties of living in capitalist society without working to overcome capitalism itself. But I think that we can at least recognize degradations of human relationships as real degradations. And we can recognize these degradations as active impediments to building the real bonds of solidarity that we need to engage in mass political struggle. So with that, we can think about what are some commonly held, and I think actually for the most part uncontroversial beliefs about social media. I guess one is that it distracts us. Even when we're with other people, our attention is divided in such a way that it limits and fractures the integrity of conversation when people are just like looking at their phones all the time. Another is that it leads to this obsession with self-perception, like a new kind of digital narcissism, which is now quantified in likes and followers and whatnot. A third is that it prevents us from ever really being alone with ourselves and, doing the things that we do when we're comfortable with being alone, like reading and learning new skills and whatnot. And then I guess the fourth trait of social media usage is that it reduces the complexity in conversation, that it has really in many ways completed the trajectory began on television in making all discourse essentially soundbite discourse. So if we add up all these traits of online discourse, I think we get almost the diametrical opposite of the kind of ideal free human association just described. And this kind of association, it's built on attentiveness and care rather than distractedness. It's built on vulnerability and openness rather than narcissism. It's built on welcomed solitude rather than the avoidance of boredom. And I think above all, it's built on long, rambling, sustained face-to-face conversation rather than the sort of like disembodied information bursts that you get online of these like snap judgments. You know, in those few moments where Marx sort of envisions a communist society, he imagines this rich and nourishing association of free individuals. And on social media, I think we get, you know, a kind of thin gruel of mere connectedness, which I think more and more looks like a dystopia of human interaction. Now, I think the general dynamic of social media has particularly disastrous consequences for the left because it is inimical to the task of building solidarity and engaging in mass politics. You know, I mean, I'm tempted to do this all the time, but leftists should not be, you know, sitting at their keyboards and carefully crafting like the perfect wording for the perfect message that will, you know, magically right the wrongs of their Facebook conversations or whatever. As tempting as it is to do that, you know, we should be writing op-eds for local papers. We should be on people's doorsteps as much as possible, having face-to-face conversations where that's possible. And we should be, you know, building durable ties with union locals, like stuff like that. And all this work, it requires that we transcend the atomization and really the stupidity that we've been habituated to, and do things that might be very uncomfortable at first, but in the end, I would say, are more rewarding and constructive to advancing the cause of socialism than stewing in the cesspool of the whole Twitter universe. And I'll end it there. And I'll kick it over to Amber and Matt. And I guess just to sort of ask two opening questions that I'd be curious to hear you all talk about. You know, like one pertains to the abstractly human consequences of social media use, like just on a personal level. Like, do you agree and do you worry about the effects of social media on things like attention, empathy, thinking, and so forth? And then a second question would be, you know, it has more specifically to do with the political effects of social media use, like whether you think social media causes a hindrance for the left, or whether, as many others have argued, sometimes quite cogently, that it's a kind of boon for left politics, that it's a way to spread the message. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over to you all.
Well, Matt has some pretty sophisticated things to say about this. So I think leading with Matt's, say, nuanced tirade against posting as a poster, he might be the best person to lead with this, and then I can follow up as a self-exiled social media quietist.
I mean, I've always been uncomfortable with the roles that social media played in the left, even though I knew that like my part of it was inextricably connected to that, and that, you know, I was a poster, and that's the milieu that I did any kind of political thinking or organizing to the extent that I did. It was all there, and I was always aware that there was just a fundamental problem with that dynamic, but it felt like it was the only game in town, you know. And it wasn't really until quarantine that I was, and quarantine coming at the end of the Sanders campaign specifically, and I was forced to sort of reckon with where I was and where I was going to go, and I was, because of the circumstances, forced to spend even more time than I usually did online, At least it felt that way. What shocked me most of all was the almost instantaneous reemergence of debates and arguments that had dominated the online left space 2 or 3 years earlier, and were being relitigated on the exact same premises by the same people using the same arguments, with nothing having changed in the interim. And I think observing that was really what made me have a total crisis moment and just think, my God, what is happening here? Like, we are all trapped in hell. We're in the Barton Fink Hotel. I mean, there's no way out of this. And I think what I kind of came to realize is that people are political on the internet as a coping mechanism for the lack of political opportunities in their lives. They want to feel like they're expressing some sort of political belief that they hold, the values that make up what they consider to be their identity, but they don't see opportunities for that in their normal life, because we live in mostly depoliticized lives. We don't have a lot of encounters day to day with politics in any meaningful sense. So the urge to offload that that element of personal formation onto the internet is very, very seductive, because it's right there and it's frictionless. And that, I think, ends up being the thing that's so bad about it, that's so insidious, especially over the long run, is that it's such a frictionless, easy place to find political, to find a platform to craft a political identity that it essentially captures people. I mean, it either captures people in the sense that they find that online discourse is sufficient and all they need in their lives to satisfy a sense that they're political, when we know that that's certainly not adequate. Or if they do decide all this internet stuff isn't doing it for me, I need to go and try to be political in my day-to-day life, they bring with them the frictionless political concepts that have all been crafted online, that have never been tested in the real world, that are brittle and underdeveloped because they are developed exclusively through mostly conversations with like-minded people, and take those into the real world, where, unsurprisingly, they don't conform to any place. They're not applicable anywhere in your life, and that generally leads to people just deciding to go back to the internet because it's easier there. And then they convince themselves that they're actually doing more good online than they would have done IRL. And all it's really doing is giving a generation of people this delusional notion of what political identity and political activism is.
Yeah, I would follow up with that too. I do think, again, it is really important to notice that there was a period when, the people who considered themselves left were a part of a project of people who were not online, who didn't consider themselves left. And now, without sort of the grounding of the Sanders campaign, it's like Sanders never happened, which is like staggering. Hang on, I got a buzz in the UPS guy. Just a second, sorry. Sorry. So yeah, that's been pretty dispiriting. And I think Matt is right that some of this is more the result of like a lack of a political life than it is sort of like, it's not like things were great and then the internet came in and disrupted it. But I think when I wrote about UBI and Andrew Yang, I pointed out the fact that not only is the idea of a bunch of sort of, domesticated young people living off a stipend in their little hamster cage pod house or whatever with their 5 roommates very dispiriting, we are now anesthetized by this new factor in a way that a technology and a social force that hasn't existed prior. And I think it's inherently a bad one. And this isn't even to discuss sort of the medium of the internet as inherently bad, but I think social media only exists as it is because it is a rotten fruit born of a rotten tree. And one of the things that I said in my UBI piece is that it makes sense to compare the internet to, like, I do think it makes sense to compare the internet to like drugs, particularly where, so like I have a friend who does meth twice a year. She gives the kid to the grandparents for a 3-day weekend, does a little meth, cleans her whole house top to bottom. She's a very happy woman with a nice family and a mortgage, and her husband's like a union electrician. And so that's the relationship that she has to a drug that we tend to consider an automatic, life destroyer. Like, you do it once, you're addicted, and then all of a sudden your teeth are gone and you're in jail. The fact of the matter is that when we think of like the opioid crisis, these are not the people that we're talking about are not my friend. They usually weren't doing very well in the first place, and so they have a different relationship to drugs. I think posting is kind of the same thing, where for a thriving, healthy person with some kind of a political life and social life and meaningful bonds, the internet might not be so terrible. Twitter might not be so terrible, but most people aren't like that, so it's a shithole. So even the people who are doing well, when they go onto these platforms, are poisoned because the dominant environment of these places is a bunch of suffering people inflicting their suffering on everyone else. So to me, it doesn't really matter if you are like, I got something good out of the internet. Like, I got a lot of good things. I made a lot of friends, and it built my career. That doesn't mean that it isn't a net negative or that it is worth it, or that we can make like a nice internet, because fundamentally you can't make a socially positive place out of a bunch of socially disaffected people. So that's kind of the impasse, is how I see it. And people, again, they get very defensive because they're like, well, but I like this thing. I'm like, well, yeah, I like cigarettes. They're not good for me.
Yeah.
It's not a personal judgment, but they feel so personal about the internet because it kind of is their friend. And for Matt and I, a lot of our job is, we provide people with exposure to the sort of conversations they would have if they were online all the time, and if they had like just completely different lives. And the appeal of, I think, our podcast isn't even so much that we're saying the most insightful things or that we're all brilliant, but people feel like they, unlike the internet, are watching, we are friends that are having a conversation. It's why we're more popular than maybe like smarter people, and even better spoken people, even funnier people, because it is like kind of voyeuristic, and we are friends that are having real conversations and having fun with each other, and people like to watch that. Because there's a piece on what is a podcast in Damage that it's like, oh, it's pornography for people who can't have sex. And it kind of is. Podcasts is porn for friendship. And so, that's also like the existence of the medium is such a product of its time. And I'm much happier doing this, and I think this has much more potential to be something useful to people as a medium than anything on social media. I mean, like the fact that we can tell people to canvas or whatever is very useful. But it's still not ideal, you know? It's still, I don't like that a major touchstone for a lot of people like, oh, that's how I got into politics and knew that I could have, you know, like social democratic values and conversations and not be like woke or pious, is from Chapo. And I'm like, oh, that's so great. But is it great? Would it be better if you just, you know, if you were in a union, you would just be around problematic people who had good labor politics. Like if you were in a left union and they would just be your friends, you wouldn't be watching them, you would be with them and you would be having those conversations. So I mean, again, I like what I do, and I think it's been strangely enough a way for people to sort of disengage from online in some ways, but it's still such a paltry substitute for what I want people to have, and I don't know how to get from here to there. So just keep podcasting, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, a big problem is that the internet exists to soothe your thwarted desires. Like
Mhm.
that, the internet is a pacifier. I mean, that's what it is. Everything that you don't have in your life, you can get a simulation of, and that includes sex, achievement in simulation in the forms of video gaming, and politics. A way to feel like you're becoming a political subject.
Well, and friendship.
Yeah, that
I
you.
mean,
But it's also predicated on never actually delivering any of those things, on only giving you the simulated version that you keep having to come back for. And the inevitable result of that dynamic is you lose, you get desensitized, and you need more and more because it's not sufficient, because it's merely this. If anything, it's just agonizing the wound of your desire, because it's not fulfilling it. It's only giving you this wire mother version of it, which means that on every along every axis, from consumption of pornography to video games to being online politically, you have to get more intense. You have to do more of it to get the same buzz that you used to get out of a lesser engagement with it, which means that the very structure of the internet, because that's where the money is in the clicks, militates against ever doing anything constructive or positive. And that means that the dream of formulating a meaningful, like, political movement that is actually going to move the needle in this world online, it's built, of course, that's going to be part of the lure of online politics, because that's how they get you. But it's also impossible to ever be satisfied. It can never happen.
I mean, to place devil's advocate, I guess, you know, you get a lot of people who I think would agree about the negative effects of social media, like agree with what sort of we've been going over here, but who would still insist that, you know, socialists interested in mass politics should be engaging mass communications platforms, right? So if you're starting I don't know, a DSA chapter somewhere and you want to get people to a meeting, like, you know, posting Facebook events and on Twitter is probably actually a good way to get real live people there.
it's not. You know this, though. You know that it's not.
Well, it can be. I mean, I think that, like, this is where, like, some distinction between different uses of social media might be helpful. I mean, just sort of posting information like, hey, we are meeting at this day on this day at this place, and advertising, you know, actual events in that way can actually be quite helpful. You know, turning people out to canvases through Facebook advertising is actually surprisingly effective sometimes. It's where the information posting goes to having substantive conversations about that information, as if that is real substantive engagement, that I think it sort of goes off the rails.
I think
Not that those two could ever be separated.
Sure. I think that the one thing that I always said that I think still holds true is that the only true use of online for any political benefit is to get people offline, and to get people in person. And even so, like, when I did, a lot more organizing for DSA, and I would do labor events and stuff like that, honestly, social media is not the best way to even pack a room. Like, having a list of people that you reach out to personally, because one, you are fighting, it is a room of people screaming, and the fact that you would be heard isn't particularly likely, or it's just they're trying to process so much information that they're like, there's an event, and another event. You're trying to compete with all of these events. The old, just, Communist Party, the American Communist Party, like, tradition and dedication to things like phone banks and lists and talking to people, and they would go to people's houses, which you would consider insane now, and just knock on a door and just be like, hey, we're doing this thing, here's a flyer, and we're going to be talking about this. That has a way better retention rate than posting an event. Emails are better than Facebook. Facebook is better than Twitter. A phone call is better than all of those. It just is. And I think the other thing too is that younger people especially, we have this new sense of privacy that is very ironic and at odds with how unprivate the internet is. So there used to be a book called The Phone Book, and it had everyone's fucking phone number in it. And you could just look up somebody's phone number and call them. And the only people that weren't in the phone book were like crazy cranks or celebrities or whatever. Like, everyone was in the phone book. And that is insane to think of today. They're like, why would anyone have your phone number? However, because we consider that like a violation of privacy. However, what we don't consider a violation of privacy, because we do it voluntarily without thinking about it, is to chronicle our every waking moment. And you know what? Maybe also we don't consider it a violation of privacy because everyone is lying online. Everyone is creating a persona. Everyone is creating a different idea of themselves. So it doesn't feel like a violation of privacy. But even so, it is insane how we have become more closed off from people and would consider something like a phone call to be like pushy and a violation. Yeah, but we are expected to volunteer all this shit about ourselves constantly.
Yeah, we've replaced that kind of vulnerability to contact, like having a phone, to just having a totally transparent public persona, which then like stands in for our personal self, because our personal self doesn't talk to any of these people. Like, these are weirdos from the internet. I don't talk to them. I am a version of myself that makes me feel more smarter, more effectual, more insightful than I actually am. And that depends on distance, because it falls away as soon as you're actually meeting somebody, and they don't have those baffles of screens in order to present themselves in a certain way. I think that the distinctions we're making here are important. Like you said, like Facebook, in terms of getting people to a thing, Facebook, email better than Facebook, better than Twitter, that there is an informational role that online can play and should play, but that it's the reason that still doesn't make up for all of the negative feedback from the internet is that it's impossible to disentangle, because the same matrices that are going to have you see, hey, there's going to be a demonstration here, there's going to be a talk here, something. That's also where you go for all of your takes, and that's where you go for all of your arguments, and that's where you go to make enemies and friends, and then keep those lines as careful as possible. And so even if you do use it to go to a real thing, you're going there with a head full of internet that's not going to be helpful to anybody.
You shouldn't get your politics from the pornography box.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that should be simple, but
Those should not be in the same container.
It does a very good job of making you forget that that this is the pornography box.
Yeah.
Because the website, it's like, no, I got all my friends on here. We're all talking about politics. Look at all the flags on their bios. It's like, no, one click over and it's just people fucking and sucking.
Yeah.
And it's serving, and it's both those things are doing the same thing for you.
Yeah. They're providing a simulation
of something you cannot express in your real life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did have a question, and I wonder what you guys think of, because the whole there's the denialism of sort of very specific types of social behavior that you usually associate with like sectarian cults now operate on the internet, like purges and defamation, like things that normal people usually only ever experience if they were like in a sectarian cult or a religious cult. Now normal people get this like online on the internet all the time, and it seems completely obvious, but there are a lot of people who love to write the cancel culture doesn't exist, there's no such thing as the vampire's castle. They're like denialists, which is very strange to me, because these are the same people who would never say if I said I'm experiencing racist abuse or I'm experiencing sexism, they would be like, that's terrible, that's awful. But if I'm like, I'm experiencing something outside of like a specific type of an abuse that exists outside of a specific type of identity-based bigotry, and I'm experiencing a strange kind of bullying, and people are trying to get me fired, and they're emailing and tweeting at my boss, and they're lying about me, and they're saying terrible things about me, and they would be like, that's not real. That's not real. Cancel culture isn't real. It's not real. And it reminds me of the scene in Mean Girls when they have the assembly where they're talking about what Joe Freeman calls trashing. All the girls were just trashing each other, and they're like, look, the bullying has got out of hand. And the biggest bully in school like raises her hand and says, I just want to say that this school doesn't have a click problem. So it's just like this thing where there is a number of people really invested in the idea of like obfuscating really cruel, vicious behavior and antisocial behavior, and frankly, really dangerous behavior that undermines things like, employment rights. And, I'm going to tweet until someone gets fired. Those things are so anathema, I think, to kindness or solidarity, or just like having friends and feeling secure enough around people that you can form connections. But the kind of, media class denialism, I think some of them are true believers. Some of them are like, first rule of cancel culture is you do not talk about cancel culture. And I don't know how to talk about this, because I used to have an advice column, and like half the shit I would get would be like, everyone's being mean to me and I don't know what to do. And if I say that they're being mean to me, they keep telling me like, no, well, what did you do? I don't know how to break with something like that. Like I'm or how to help anyone with something like that. Like I'm uncancelable. I've been, first of all, everyone loves me because I've never done anything wrong. So it's not a problem for me. But people live in sort of constant terror of their so-called comrades. I mean, there's a bunch of Stepford wife kind of, there's a lot of like Stockholm syndrome to it too. And the internet is a home for it in a way that normal life isn't. You have to be, because you form kind of a sect on the internet. It's very divisive. I don't know what in God's name to do about something like that.
Well, I feel like I've noticed that kind of denialism in people who, encourage everyone to see social media more instrumentally and less personally. Like people who are like, don't try to don't like take it too personally, right? Sort of like use it for your own ends, but don't invest yourself too much in it. And it's almost like they want you to take more of like a depersonalized workplace attitude towards social media. Just like, don't invest yourself too much in it. It's not actually an expression of your personality or anything. And I always find, I don't know, they're like effortlessly wield social media and log off and like forget it all, right? But I think that position can sometimes like elide the ways in which like we're kind of formed by the situations that we're in and the structures that we take part in. And it's difficult not to invest yourself in being online if you are. It's difficult to take that sort of like casual, distanced, instrumental, sort of professional almost.
Particularly if it's all you
media.
have. If it's all you have. I mean, the people I know who have active political lives, you know, families, like, you know, friends, like real friends, they might go on Twitter every once in a while to be like, oh yeah, I'm only on basketball Twitter, which is like, you know, they just talk about sports or something, and they have just a completely different relation to it because they have because they have a real life. I think if you don't have a real life, and even sometimes if you do, it's completely impossible to just log off and disappear. And brush it off. Like, you can't, it's the only thing you have. It takes paramount importance.
Right, because you have you have two groups of people, as specifically on Twitter. It seems like you have two groups of people who treat Twitter like it's life or death, and essentially treat it like it is their workplace. And one group of them are the people who, for whom that is actually true. They have a media job that has some sort of social media component to it, and of course, they probably spend more time on there than they're required to by their bosses. But in their head, this is what they have to do for their jobs. The other people are people who have so much invested of themselves psychically in their political identity that is formed through online discourse that it is essentially their workplace in terms of like their actual work. If they have a job, and a lot of them don't, if they have a job, that is an alienated space where they don't feel like they feel like they're fully being instrumentalized, and it's dead time for them. Being online is where they get to be political, and so it's as much of a place for like finding self identity through like creative work as a fulfilling job would be, even though it's entirely illusory. And that kind of environment is going to raise the stakes over time, like within the person and over time, because it just has to be what it can never be. It has to be a place where people can find something that's just it's not possible to discover there. And so it gets more fraught, and the need to cancel people and which is I see is universal. And any clique, regardless of what their ideological formation is, those internal regimentations exist because that's how you maintain order. That's how you know who the good guys and the bad guys are. And it's inevitable and necessary because in the minds of all the people on here, the stakes are so high. This is the political ground. This is the battleground of ideas. This is where the future is being determined. Of course, all weapons are to be at your disposal in that case. Of course, opinions are worth someone being canceled or fired for. It's all we have. Like, how could you possibly say it's just what they said or just their opinion? That's the sum total of their identity.
Well, yeah, and I think going back to the good guys and bad guys thing, because people form an insular, clique on the internet, and they find, you immediately find people that remind you of yourself, or, that you want to remind you of yourself, and so you form your own little like community. And when who are you? You're the good guys. Well, who are the bad guys? If you're not actually around any bad guys.
Yeah.
Like if you are only around your friends, then and someone has to go. We have to be fighting someone. But also the only people I see are the people in my group. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'll go after them.
Yeah.
Because that's what they think sort of politics is sort of purifying ranks, and a lot of it is also, I think, influenced by the idea of prefigurative politics, where it's like, well, we have to have this group of people that are, you can't do good politics without having good politics, which historically is not true at all. You get good politics by participating in projects that have a good political basis. And then while doing them, you figure out, the reason I'm fighting for, say, healthcare is because everyone deserves it. The reason I'm fighting for it for me is because everyone deserves it, because it's a universal thing. And also people deserve all of these other things. And also look at all of these things that these people have and all of the wealth in our country. And like, it just develops out there. You start thinking about things by doing things. And I think people don't get that. I remember I wrote about this. There was a girl who said, she said, well, like, what do I do if like a Pepe wants to join my union? And I was like, then you won. What are you talking about? Like, it's a union. It's not a social club. It's not a group of like-minded people. It's a group of people with, it's a perfect institution when it operates well, because it is the only thing that forces people to form a collective self-interest, which transcends beliefs, ideology, anything. And then if you're good at it, like, the beliefs and ideology form themselves around that collective self-interest.
Yeah. But I think the reason that's possible, the reason that like the Pepe and the union thing is so terrifying to someone who has a internet that's internet-based politics, because like we're saying, all politics is just the accumulation of your posts. That means that every post has to have it be freighted with meaning, because that's your political action is posting. So that means the opinions you put online are meaningful. They have like this weight to them. Whereas if you are politically active in the real world, this is a real distinction. You do fewer things about politics, right? Like, you're not posting 2,500 times a day, but you are, say, going to a union meeting every week, or you're going to a study meeting, or you're going to a picket line or a demonstration. That cumulatively, that's many fewer acts, but they are more psychically and emotionally and politically satisfying, because they actually involve doing something. They don't have to be. There doesn't have to be this accumulation of absolutely weightless posts that together are supposed to form a political identity. So that is one reason that it's insidious to find the internet to be the place where you're doing your political formation, because you end up putting all of life or death on all of these things that in a real world situation would essentially never even come up, because there would be practical concerns to deal with. But there is no practical anything on the internet. It's all theoretical. It's all hypothetical, and it's all in a frictionless plane of putting together a perfect theory rather than finding what works through action. And the other thing that I think is absolutely like built into the source code of online discourse that makes it just impossible to build positively from is when we're talking about the need to have an in-group and an out-group, and a need to like find traitors within to purify and also to show your own virtue. The real problem with that is yes, obviously it creates a paranoid atmosphere, creates a lack of solidarity, the opposite of solidarity. But what it also does is it trains your argumentation. It trains your way of talking about politics to be about appealing to a group point of view. Like, if you're in an argument with somebody, the way you win is by saying this person is not, this person's point of view is not in alignment with our values, whatever your subgroup thinks that means. But that means that it is impossible to have any kind of engagement. I'm not talking about like debating, just literally addressing arguments by the other side, because your only mode of argument is by appealing to a group consensus that they're not part of. And more importantly, a third person watching you who's not politically invested in either side is not part of. And so pointing that out to them and saying, like, this person has violated X, Y, or Z, if X, Y, or Z are not part of what they care about, they're not going to give a shit. And that goes for like your political opponents, but it more importantly goes for a person who's just trying to figure out what they even believe in. And they see you appealing to this group consensus that they have not bought into, because they have not been part of your group. That means it's almost that you have created a argumentative and rhetorical strategy and mindset that is actually unintelligible to people outside of the group. Because at the end of the day, you will always reach for the easy option of censorship and excommunication. And it's like, just from a raw rise to power, will to power perspective, that can work in an in-group, but it by definition won't work with people who aren't part of that group because they don't care if they're kicked out. They're not in.
Yeah. And also, it makes you look insane.
Yeah.
Like, there has to be something like a word for leftists. I mean, I usually say it about liberals, but they become these people who don't think that anything the right ever says about them is true. Like, they would never consider that. That's anathema to them. And it's like, you don't want to be in that position, because all that means is that when they make a point that is true, you double down on that behavior, whether it is good or whether it is bad. And it's essentially forming a political identity in negation, which doesn't make any sense anyway, because like all of these things are kind of moving targets, and what people say about you is, it's going to change. I'm not really sure. Most people who are online or politically online really have any politics that exist outside of their opposition to someone else at this point. It's all because, again, it's an attempt at sociality. They understand, I think, on base levels that like maybe there are sort of injustices, or if they're right wing, they understand that their life is shitty. If they're like the new conservative, Pepe things that are like, in the post-war period, I probably would have had a job and a wife and maybe even a house, and they understand that things are shitty. I'm not sure if they know what the sort of politics for them is an identity. It's not a means to an end. It's not like a worldview. It's not like they're like, this is how the world works, and I think this is how the world should work, and this is how I think we get there. It's more of a, there are these bad people, and my job is to defeat them, and that generally amounts to posting.
I mean, like, maybe I'm not, familiar enough with the kind of like quality of like vitriol of like online arguments and stuff like that.
Hey, you have like a flip phone.
It's true. I've been outed. But there is, I mean, to go back to the cult comparison, it does feel like there's something slightly different there. I mean, in sort of like traditional religious cultish behavior, right? There's like a group defending itself against some kinds of like, threats to group life, disintegration of group life. And they do that by demonizing some, probably already marginalized part of that group, right? But in social media, I mean, there isn't that same kind of pre-existing group that you're defending. I mean, when you're lashing out against someone as what seems like group behavior, it's almost like, well, let me put it this way. I think that there are moments in group life that are good, right? There are like moments of group life that don't involve demonization and marginalization and vitriol. But the thing with social media posting is because there's no natural group, right? All these groups are sort of built from the ground up by individuals. Like, we lack the kind of communal structures that even our grandparents and even our parents had. And so in the absence of those communal structures, we have to like build up something for ourselves that's always in jeopardy, that's always at risk of falling apart. And so it does sort of feel like there's something more almost necessary about that vitriol that's not even true of like cults.
I would advance, though, the possibility that it's like, okay, so if you were a Puritan, burning witches, the the larger structures forcing down on you was like, one, you were like a really weird religious minority that was essentially asked to leave England, and two, just the environment. Like it's a horror. It's like they picked the coldest, shittiest place to start a new utopia, and they were just dying like flies constantly. And Native Americans were not happy to see them, so they were they had attacks, and of course they turned on each other, and they're like, we have to purify our ranks. Also, that woman might be undercutting my my medical entrepreneurialism by being a midwife. She's a witch. Blah blah blah. When the CP became really, really ruthless and cruel to each other, they were executing the Rosenbergs. It was HUAC. I mean, they were under attack. I think that's a good point, and there is something unique here. I don't think there's a direct attack, but I do think that these are people who a lot of times are largely experiencing a big mass of downward mobility in American life, particularly for a generation. And the sort of like a new neoliberal order is crushing, and it's not cool or romantic the way, like, being targeted by the CIA or the cold New England winter is. But I think to say that they aren't under a duress and that duress isn't contributing to it maybe overlooks the fact that the duress that people are experiencing is really vague and very diffuse, and it's this kind of quiet neoliberal. I mean, like, our entire lives are like a lot of them are professionals too. Like the amount of authority that like HR has over people. I think it's harder to pinpoint the kind of the pressures or the factors in people's misery are, because it's like it's this big kind of unruly new political, social, economic order, and that's not as obvious as McCarthy or a cold New England winter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't saying that like duress is not involved. It just sort of seems like even in any group, there are benefits to being part of actual real life groups, and it sort of seems like in a lot of online communities, in scare quotes, you get all the negative aspects of group life, but none of the sort of like positive benefits of group life.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is, so to use a very awkward metaphor, like political organizing, creating a political movement, being part of a political movement. It's like building a ship. So you're going to get in the water and you're going to go to a new place, a new place that's better than this place. And the way you build a ship is everybody gets together and you build a ship, and you learn how to do it by doing it. Like you learn how to sand a keel and stand up the mast and all that stuff. And the internet is this lure to tell people, hey, we'll teach you how to build a ship. And people go on there thinking, thank God, I'm going to learn how to build a ship. There's no shipyards in my town. This is a way for me to do this. But what you're actually learning is how to build a ship in a bottle. And then when it's time for everybody to get off the internet and come together, instead of having the corpus of knowledge to actually take some wood and build a ship, they've all just got their individual ship in a bottle, which will get them precisely nowhere. And that's because the frictionless plane of online does not allow you to incorporate the feedback loop of real world experience into your understanding. And that means that you will never be able to translate it to other people, because it doesn't have a common referent way that experientially based understanding of politics does. It's only a singular referent of you and your particular encounter on the internet.
I would argue as well too that there's something to the fact that like all of the book recommendations and things like that, like in terms, like speaking of experience, they tend to be like theory or like, like a neoliberal hucksters like Robin DiAngelo or something like that. They're all sort of how-tos or theory. They are rarely history, and they are almost never memoir, which seems really essential to me. Then, I mean, it just seems like why isn't that like a really integral part of things? Like, we have people telling you their stories. I mean, again, I don't know why. Maybe I should do an event or something on Vivian Gornick's Romance of American Communism. But like, there are all of these people that recorded their experiences, and it's actually kind of like insane when you're like, well, this already happened. If we just read this, we'd be like, oh, this is that thing. Let's not do that. Let's not repeat that problem, because there are people there who will tell you what things mean on the ground. And instead, I think people sort of engage in this kind of like cryptography where they like read, theory, or even the histories they do read. They tend to be sort of like, like the Russophiles or Tenkis or something, and they think that like, they're gonna find the secret message and be able to repeat it. It's like, you live in America in 2020. At the very least, maybe like read actual accounts from like 19th century like organizers or something like that. But they gravitate towards how-to stuff and workshop stuff and theory and grand historical narratives of countries that have nothing to do, that don't even have any comparison. Like, they're not reading about like, the development of the British welfare state. It's like all like Russia, China, things like that. Like, it's just, it seems like what they want is the most exotic and impersonal approach to politics possible, which I think is backwards.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting point, because what you get in history is very much opposed to the kind of like good, like very clear good bad discourse you get online. You get a mess of like moral ambivalence, and then two, you get,
as put it, Stalin made a number of errors.
and you also get distance. You get to experience something that's like not your reality as a way of better understanding your reality. So you get that sort of distance and sort of understanding that things could be differently.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, wait, are we to? Okay, Kale.
Yeah. Hey. So yeah, I wanted to jump in to also validate that Stalin only made a couple mistakes. But no, I think someone on Facebook, I think Lantos wrote, I think the general rule is that LARPers, or the people who principally see the left as an identity, LARPers always heavily outnumber the doers. But with expanding the base of the LARPers, we also expand the base of the doers, and the ratio stays the same, but the bigger the pool, the more fish there is to catch. And I think there's some truth to that. And I remember, actually, Amber, you and I don't know if we were seeing an Extinction Rebellion rally, or if we were just talking about it, but that there's plenty of people who are, it's very much a cultural phenomenon, and but at the same time, there's still like a new crop of people who are going to come out of that experience. And similarly now with protests now that are going to come out far more radicalized, or considering like, how do we actually deal with political economy? How do I, deal with these issues materially?
I'm not sure what he means though. I think the assumption that it expands the, so grows the LARPers, so grows the real activists or whatever. One, that's one of those things that sounds right, but I don't know that that's true. You would have to provide me some kind of, information to show that there's any correlation between those two things. The other thing I would point out is that actually, again, if you read memoir, you figure out that most people, when they come out of a big, disastrous failure of a political project, they don't do it anymore.
Right.
Sometimes, sometimes people really only have one go in them. So you want to make sure it's actually something substantive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I also would question the assumptions of the question. I mean, it sort of seems like the assumption is that there's this larger base of sort of like online activist types that sort of show up for events and are, bring their online politics to political spaces, and then from that pool of people, you can convince some people to get offline and think more strategically and all this stuff. And I think I'd agree that I'm not sure that that's always how it happens. I think that that's the sort of fantasy of some online organizing, that you get people to go from online to offline, and once they're offline, to convince them to do more. But yeah, that hasn't actually been my experience so much.
It has not been my experience either. It has not also been my experience that my experience has been that when people fail at something that had a serious plan behind it, they keep going. Because the politics and the things that they learned in doing that were, they can still take with them to a new thing. I don't, when people are a part of something that just never had any chance of succeeding in the first place, and when they get away from it, like Occupy, I don't know many people who came out of sort of the most eccentric aspects of Occupy to do really anything. They came out of it and thought, oh, that was a giant, ridiculous waste of time. It's all a giant, ridiculous waste of time. And the people, I think, who did come out of Occupy to, move on to something else, one, are very young, so they have more time and energy. Or two, in that encounter, they, by pure happenstance, encountered something more substantive. Or they got a consulting business out of it.
Right.
And I think that one of the, like in my more like pessimistic moments, like about the sort of contemporary situation, like if there's cause for worry, I think right now it's that the real ties that were built through the Bernie campaign are actually not going to be followed through on. That there isn't a clear direction for all the people who came out to do real organizing work for Bernie. I mean, the
lot of them
victory,
are forming their own PACs, working for right-wing Democrats.
right. Well, those are the sort of like upper echelons. But I'm talking more about like, I mean, here in Phoenix, where I live, like in the weeks leading up to the Arizona primary, like I organized a canvas where 70 people came out, and that might not be impressive in New York, but in Arizona, it's
that is
it's
impressive
a
in New York.
miracle.
That is impressive in New York.
And I mean, a lot of those people they were roped into the Bernie movement through whatever means, but I've never seen their online profiles, and I actually don't think that they came in through social media. And they're people who came to canvas. They came to knock on doors. And I think that if there's a worry right now, it's that infrastructure is actually not being used, that it's like wasting away as the upper management of the Bernie campaign goes on to form those PACs and do their work.
Also, that shit absolutely withers, and I think people don't understand that, is that a list becomes useless after 2 years. It's generally the rule of thumb in organizing. If you're not using it, so the idea that like, well, yeah, but we've got this list, and it's like, it's just a sleeping giant. It's like, no, if you don't give them something to do, that stuff, they don't respond, they're not connected, they don't have any memory of the thing, they get new phone numbers, they get new fucking information, they just have completely different lives. And then that means you have to start all over, and it's harder to get someone who did something and then drifted away than it is to get a new person. But the problem is that new people don't have any experience, and so you want to retain people who have experience, and that's just why you kind of have to do a lot of tedious work in the interim that is slow building, which is not sexy and not romantic and also not conducive to internet politics because you have to think of the long game, and there's something the internet does something to time too, where it assumes both that everything is right around the corner, but also we have an infinite amount of time.
Yeah. Internet shit, one of the main distorters is it gives people this idea that they're going to live to see some sort of version of what they're imagining, and that they need to wait for the thing that's going to make that happen. And it's like, no.
That's what the CP said too. Like the revolution is right around the corner.
Yeah.
And that's when things were actually happening.
Right.
And nothing is happening now, and people still believe the revolution is right around the corner. I mean, there's like unrest, but there's no organization, you know?
Because the sort of self decentering it would take to remove yourself from the equation of a better world, that's more than most people can really manage, because that's not how we're acculturated. We're acculturated to want to seek self-interest. And the internet is designed to soothe our self-interests. And that means politics takes that same shape. And that means that when we say, hey, we want things to be better, it means I want things to be better for me, and I'm going to see it, and it's going to happen. And that creates this fog of sort of frenzy and hysteria around everything, and distorts every response to real conditions, because to do otherwise would be to make, because people would give up if they didn't think they could see it in their own lives, because if they couldn't, what would be the point?
Yeah, there's no sense of like working for future generations or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think, I do think though that like, I don't consider myself pessimistic, but I'm like, look, the revolution isn't around the corner. I do think, and I don't think we're not gonna topple capitalism in my lifetime. If we did though get a socialized healthcare system in my lifetime, which I think is possible, that would be huge. That would be amazing. That would be a world historic. I mean, like, the Brits still celebrate their NHS every fucking year. Like, it is one of the crown achievements of humanity. So it's almost like they have to believe that like the revolution is around the corner, because they don't appreciate how significant basic social democratic reforms are. They don't appreciate how big it would be to bolster the trade union movement so that we had the tools to build things and move forward for future generations. It's like, well, no, you do win sometimes. It's just not like in the movies. The wins are real though, and you feel really good, and they make the world better, and they make us stronger. And I'm sorry, you're gonna die one day, and but you will, at the end of your life, still have people that will outlive you that you care about. So do it for them.
I mean, just to pick up on one thing there, I mean, there is something, of course, like very idealist about being online, which is that, the whole theory of change is that by finding the right wording for the right post, you'll be able to convince X number of people that this is the right position, right? And I do feel like there's just the theory of change is just sort of off, and the kind of theory of change at work in something like Medicare for All is almost the exact opposite. Like, you change people's minds by giving them the material goods, right? That like people will come around to socialist politics, left politics, not when they're given the right argument, but when they see that actually it makes a big difference to their lives.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think just to wrap up, to kind of touch on one last thing, the topic of this being logged the fuck off, and it being more or less a voluntary action of how to deal with the issue of social media, of taking yourself out of it. And, of course, what Amber is touching on, what Ben just said, of like, the campaigns and the projects that really are meaningful that we should be doing, like Medicare for All or labor organizing, being kind of, that's how we should be spending our time. But I'm wondering if you guys had thoughts on what should socialists be doing about social media? Like, what is our, like, I know, Ben, you've used the analogy before that, individual automobile ownership is not something that would translate over into socialism, that there's certain things that we would leave behind. And so how I've understood what you've said so far is that social media should not move with us into socialism. Whether or not, of course, that's socialism more as the principles guiding us towards a better society, I guess. So I was wondering if you guys had thoughts on, reforms, or what do we actually do about social media aside from just getting off of it?
I'm actually not sure that like there's something necessarily directly to do about it. And in making that point, I was just sort of like, I guess, raising a hypothetical. I think that many people might not want to, attack social media directly, but I think that they're more willing to see that the kind of social imperatives that lead people to be on social media will be less if we lived in a better society, right? If we weren't starved for some kind of like community, if we weren't starved for social interaction, that we take in these like bite-sized bits through social media because we don't have time or energy or communities to get it elsewhere. People are going to be online in that kind of situation. But in, I think, a better society where we had more free time, again, to sort of cultivate and develop human relationships in the real world, I think the kind of like imperatives, the social compulsions behind social media would begin to evaporate a little bit.
I think also I would want to say that my social media quietism and departure from it for years. Although I went back to Instagram for like a month during quarantine because I was so starved for human contact. But now it's gone because now I can hang out with my friends again because I don't need it. I think that's the thing, is that I was thriving, so I didn't need it and I didn't want it, and I got what I wanted out of it, which is that like now if I write something, I can get people to read my work, but also I still do it using social media. I make Chapo do it for me. I outsource it. So I'm still using the platforms. I'm not like, look, there are no clean hands in a dirty world. And if you're not like a professional writer or something, I mean, I highly recommend social media quietism. But really, the only reason I can do that and be like, whew, glad I'm off there, is because I'm doing well and I'm happy and I have friends and I have rewarding work and hobbies and, frankly, financial security. So I think sort of talking prescriptively about people leaving social media and doing a mass exodus, is kind of a backwards. It's a sort of an anarchist solution of like, we'll form our own. It's like, well, Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens, and Capital doesn't care if you're not on its platforms. I recommend it for your attention span. If you have friends and people in your life, and Twitter doesn't abate some kind of aching loneliness that we feel in this era of aching loneliness. But it's not a political gesture to like leave social media. It's just it helps me read more novels now, and I don't have to like pay attention to really boring gossip from stupid, ugly people. And it's also like LinkedIn now too, because like when Twitter was new, and Matt remembers this, like it was actually appealing because it had this early era when people were just being like fucking weird and funny, and those people I think are still on there and still using the medium that way. But now it's got this entirely different like blue check kind of ecosystem to it. So it's like, it's just, even the things that I did like about it that I found creatively interesting are just sort of like, I left because I wanted to and because I didn't need it. I didn't leave because I thought it was going to make the world a better place.
I would say that, yeah, there would be no social media in a socialist society because
We wouldn't want it.
we wouldn't need it. But if you're talking about like reforms in the near term, like how do you reform police? How do you reform medical systems in an era when you don't have the power to actually overthrow capitalism? I would like to see those kind of things nationalized for the purpose of changing the attitude of the people who run them towards it. Because now, because it's a run for profit, the attitude is the more people clicking, the longer, the better, right? Because that's where the money is. I think the one overriding benefit of a nationalized internet, and specifically nationalized social media platforms, is they would ideally be operating from the principle of this is a unfortunately very social sin that we need to manage the way we do with like alcohol and cigarettes. And that would have its own, I mean, I don't know what it would look like, but just having that difference of at the top, as in the people administering it, would, I think, ameliorate some of the worst tendencies of it. You need to see it as a pathogen, as a social pathogen. You need to see it as something that is corrosive to any kind of society you're trying to build, not as something that's just a fucking slot machine punching out money for the stockholders.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a really good interview with David Bowie, like right when the internet started. It's so good. And he's like, I'm fascinated by the internet, by what's going to become and what it's going to be. And this is before anyone cared about it because it was just nerd shit. And the interviewer was like, yeah, but isn't it just like a tool? He's like, no, it's its own thing. It has its own logic. It can do amazing and terrible things. And I can't wait to see what they are. He wasn't wrong.
Indeed.
I think that's the best way to end this, and with Bowie always. Thank you all for jumping on the stream tonight. Thank you to everyone watching. Just another reminder that on Friday we have Bill Fletcher Jr. talking about Juneteenth, and on Saturday we have Sean Jacobs talking with Anna and Michael about all the stuff that's going on. So thank you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Night.
Thanks.
So.
Night.
Mm-hmm.